There was a commercial that appeared during the Super Bowl a couple weeks ago. The commercial depicted scenes of people washing other people's feet. A son washing his father's feet at the dining room table. A police officer washing a civilian's foot in an alleyway. A student washes another student's foot in the hallway after class. A man washes another man's feet by a roaring campfire. It continued to show scene after scene of unlikely people who you wouldn't ordinarily see together washing each other's feet. People from opposite ends of the cultural and political spectrum coming together in this beautiful act of humility and servanthood. And then the commercial ends with these words on the screen: Jesus didn't teach hate, he washed feet. I thought it was a beautiful message, but believe it or not, some people were really upset by this commercial. I mean, they were really upset. People thought it was too scandalous. They thought it was too bizarre. They thought it was too provocative. In fact, of all the 2024 Super Bowl ads, the Washington Post branded this commercial as the most controversial. And according to the Washington Post, the ad was meant to promote the teachings of Jesus and unite different groups of people, but perhaps unsurprisingly, all they've done is foment hostility. Well, this morning we are continuing our sermon series, Light and Life, as we look at the life and ministry of Jesus according to the Gospel of John. Here we see yet another controversial and scandalous scene as Jesus washes his disciples' feet. Our scripture lesson today comes from John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17. Before the festival of Passover, Jesus knew that his time had come to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them fully. Jesus and his disciples were sharing the evening meal. The devil had already provoked Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew the Father had given everything into his hands and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the table and took off his robes, picking up a linen towel and tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a wash basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he was wearing. When Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't understand what I'm doing now, but you will understand later." "No," Peter said, "you will never wash my feet." Jesus replied, "Unless I wash you, you won't have a place with me." Simon Peter said, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Jesus responded, "Those who have bathed need only to have their feet washed, because they are completely clean. You disciples are clean, but not every one of you." He knew who would betray him. That's why he said, "Not every one of you is clean." After he washed the disciples' feet, he put on his robe and returned to his place at the table. He said to them, "Do you know what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you speak correctly because I am. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you too must wash each other's feet. I've given you an example. Just as I have done, you also must do. I assure you, servants aren't greater than their master, nor are those who are sent greater than the one who sent them. Since you know these things, you will be happy if you do them." Jesus and his disciples are gathered together in the upper room, and they are celebrating the Passover festival. And in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this meal takes place on the first evening of the Passover. And they're sharing this special meal. They have all of these things to commemorate their time in Israel when God passed over the homes that were marked with the blood of the Lamb. And in order to celebrate this, on their table they have this variety of foods. They have unleavened bread, which reminded the Jews that the Israelite slaves had to flee quickly. They didn't have enough time to wait around for the dough to rise. They had bitter herbs like horseradish to remind them of the harshness and bitterness of slavery. They ate green vegetables dipped into salt water to remind them of the tears of their time as slaves back in Egypt. And then they also had 4 cups of wine, which symbolized 4 specific redemption promises from God to deliver the Israelites from slavery. But at the center of the Passover table was a lamb that had been sacrificed in the temple. The lamb would have been sacrificed on the first day of the Passover, which means that the lamb was killed on the very same day that they ate this Passover meal. But John's gospel is different. Of course, John's gospel is different. John's gospel is always different. In John's gospel, this meal takes place the night before the Passover celebration. This means that Jesus is crucified on the same day that those lambs in the temple are being killed for the Passover celebration. So in John's gospel, Jesus becomes the lamb. Jesus is the Passover lamb. And according to John, there's that deeper meaning under the surface. Jesus is taking the place of the sacrificial lamb. In fact, John points to this early on in his gospel. In the very first chapter, John the Baptist points to Jesus and he shouts, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Jesus, the sacrificial lamb, has come to create a new Passover celebration. The Jews have been celebrating their freedom from slavery, but now we are invited to celebrate our freedom from sin. Jesus offers a precursor to his act of sacrifice on the cross when he washes his disciples' feet. This is the ultimate act of humility. Jesus washes the disciples' feet, much like when Mary anointed Jesus' feet with the perfume that she poured on his feet and that she wiped with her hair. And we can picture Jesus standing up from the table. He's rolling up his sleeves. He's tying on his apron around his waist. And then he grabs a basin and a pitcher of water. And imagine the shock of the disciples when Jesus says, "Okay, take off your sandals so I can wash your dust-covered feet." Imagine this morning if I invited everyone to take off your socks and shoes and to come down forward here in the sanctuary and to wash each other's feet. I'm not sure everyone would want to do that. And I have to admit that I don't really like feet. The thought of having to wash somebody else's feet kind of grosses me out. I heard about this couple that had a very special moment of foot washing during their wedding celebration. The groom washed the bride's feet, and then the bride washed the groom's feet. And even I can admit that that's probably a really beautiful moment that they'll remember, that symbolized their service and love to one another. But following that foot washing, that couple decided that they also wanted to serve communion to all of their wedding guests. And so they didn't really think about how they had just gone and touched each other's feet, and now they're tearing off pieces of bread and giving it to people to eat. And I'm told that there were a few wedding guests who refused to take communion. Talk about putting your foot in your mouth. But in our gospel lesson this morning, Peter tries to refuse Jesus of this foot washing. Peter was upset by what Jesus was doing. It didn't seem right for Jesus to be washing Peter's feet. It should be the other way around. But Jesus insisted that he was trying to teach them something important. So he took Peter's feet in his hands and he looked into Peter's eyes and he said, "Not only should you allow me to wash your feet, but you should wash each other's feet. In fact, you should wash the feet of everyone you meet." Hence my sermon title, Soul Service. Jesus went around to each of his followers and he washed their feet. And after he washed their feet, he said, "I want you to remember that servants are not greater than their masters, nor are messengers greater than the ones who sends them." Jesus chooses to serve his disciples in a personal and intimate way. And I think sometimes we have a hard time doing this. We have a hard time accepting help. We have a hard time allowing others to serve us. We want to portray this image to the world that says, I have it all figured out. I can do it all myself. I don't need any help. But Jesus reminds us the importance of accepting acts of service with gratitude. Jesus teaches us that it's important to accept acts of service from others. But Jesus also teaches us that it's important to offer acts of service to others as well. We are to serve in ways that are up close and personal. It's not just about writing a check or dropping off some food to someone, although those are good things to do. But it's also about building relationships. It's about getting to know people. It's about hearing their stories. It's about entering into their lives and finding ways to serve them on a real and meaningful level. And it's amazing that Jesus, who is on his way to the cross, takes the time to wash his disciples' feet. It's even more amazing that Jesus still washes Judas's feet despite what happens next. But after this special moment, Judas runs out of the room in order to go and betray Jesus. And as Jesus' journey to the cross is coming closer and closer, the disciples are starting to pick up on the fact that something is going on here. Something's going wrong. They're starting to realize that Jesus is going to die soon. Jesus is about to take on this role as the sacrificial lamb. And despite all that's going on, the next chapter in John, we see that Jesus says to his disciples, "Don't let your hearts be troubled." I'm sure that John and Andrew said to each other, "Yeah, okay, Jesus, no problem. We feel better already." No, I don't think so. I think fear stayed in the room that night. They remained fearful and unsure because after 3 years, the disciples still didn't really know who they were dealing with. They didn't realize whose presence they were in. They were in fear of losing Jesus. They were afraid that their time with Jesus was coming to an end. How many of us are guilty of that same thing? Maybe you've been a Christian for the majority of your life, but you are fearful and unsure because you still don't know who you're dealing with. You're fearful and afraid because you still don't realize that you're in God's presence right now and forevermore. Jesus makes one last attempt to remind his disciples of who he really is. He senses his disciples' fear. He offers them words of comfort and assurance. He tells them to trust in him, trust in God also. He talks about his coming glorification. He tells them that God will glorify him soon. But perhaps the best thing Jesus tells his disciples is when he says, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Jesus didn't just preach this, but he lived it. Jesus showed love to the blind man when he made him see. Jesus showed love to the Samaritan woman at the well by offering her eternal living water. Jesus showed love to the paralyzed man when he healed him next to the pool of Bethesda. Jesus showed love to Lazarus when he raised him from the dead. Jesus showed love to the disciples when he washed their feet. Jesus spent his entire ministry serving others in a real and personal way. There's a wonderful story about Fred Rogers and Francois Clemens from the show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Francois, who is an African-American, plays a police officer. And in one of the most famous episodes, Mr. Rogers is soaking his feet in a pool of water on a hot, sunny day, and he invites Francois to join him and to dip his feet into the pool as well. And Francois Clemens replies, "Well, I don't have a towel." Mr. Rogers says, "You can share mine." It's a really, really powerful scene where they both place their feet into the same pool of water. It's an incredibly controversial thing to do in 1969 during the height of the civil rights movement. This is right after the news showed footage of a southern motel owner throwing acid into a segregated whites-only pool to force out black protesters. But together, Fred Rogers and Francois Clemens shared this same pool of water, soaking their feet on a hot summer day. Clemens says that Mr. Rogers would often tell him, "I love you just the way you are." Clemens also tells this great story of one particular day on the show. Mr. Rogers was singing his song, "I like you just the way you are," and you know what? You make every day a special day just by being yourself. And then Mr. Rogers walked off the set, but the whole time he was fixating his eyes on Francois Clemens. He was holding his gaze in this kind of hypnotic trance. And Francois said, "Fred, are you talking to me?" And Fred said, "Yes, I've been talking to you for 2 years, but you heard me today." As we reflect in this season of Lent, this time of self-examination and sacrifice, we can ask the question, how might we go into the world and show love to others in a real and personal way? How might we humble ourselves and follow the example of Christ? How might we be a servant to others? Jesus didn't teach hate. He washed feet.